What makes a good leader? It sounds like a pretty simple question, but I'm not so sure it is. Let's take Winston Churchill, for example. For many people, Churchill represents courage and defiance. He's the man who stood firm against the Nazis. And that's fair, but Churchill was also responsible for Gallipoli, a catastrophic First World War campaign that ended in disaster. Tens of thousands dead, a strategic failure. Doesn't quite sound like the man we remember today, does it? So let's ask something. If Britain had lost the Second World War, would we still describe Churchill the same way? Would he still be seen as courageous? Or would he be seen as reckless? A gambler maybe? Maybe the wrong man for the job? Because that's what really fascinates me about history and decision making. How often are we judging a person's character and their intent when really we're just judging the outcome they produced? Because history is full of those traits, full of people who seem to hold completely different value depending on when you encounter them. One moment they're a reckless gambler. The next, they're one of history's greatest leaders. And sometimes, it's not that the person's changed, it's that the circumstances around them changed. And I think that's exactly what happened to one young man in France. Picture this for me. Late 18th century France. A young artillery officer barks orders at the men around him. He's speaking French, but not quite like the others. There's a Mediterranean sharpness to his accent. He's not polished, not elegant, not the aristocratic Parisian type. At military school, teachers describe him as proud, reserved, solitary, difficult. If you met this young man at 16, you probably wouldn't think he was anything in particularly special. You'd probably think outsider, awkward, intense, maybe even a bit unlikable. The kind of person who probably believed that he was smarter than everybody else in the room. Not the warm type, not easy company, and certainly not the obvious future ruler of Europe. And yet, under the right circumstances, some of those exact same traits become extraordinary, because the man I'm describing would go on to become one of history's most feared and admired leaders, Napoleon Bonaparte. And here's something most people don't realize. Napoleon wasn't exactly French in the way that we often imagine him. He's born in Corsica in 1769, just a year after France had acquired the island from Genoa. So his family is culturally Italian Corsican, so French wasn't even his first language. So we've got the future Emperor of France, who begins life as an outsider, and professionally, as an artillery officer. And this matters because artillery in this era, it's not just firing cannons and hoping for the best. It's mathematics, it's engineering, precision. There's timing involved, logistics involved. We're not just talking about reckless cavalrymen charging around on instinct. This is a deeply intellectual and analytical man. And what happens next changes how people see this intense, awkward outsider. Because suddenly history explodes around him. The French Revolution tears apart the old order. Kings, aristocrats, centuries of inherited power just collapsing. And in that chaos, that's exactly when opportunity appears. Because traits that make a man difficult in peacetime can become incredibly useful in a revolution. Take the siege at Toulon. Toulon isn't just some random French city. It's one of France's most important Mediterranean naval ports. It's a deep natural harbour, the kind of place that big giant warships can anchor safely in. But right now, France does not control it because royalists have revolted against the revolution. They've effectively handed the city over to British support. So there's British warships anchored in the harbour, cannons trained outward, and to make matters worse, the surrounding heights are already in hostile hands, which means the enemy controls both the city and the heights that overlook the harbour around the city. Now, France desperately needs Toulon back, and Napoleon identifies what he thinks is the key, and it's not the city, it's the harbour. And more importantly, it's not just the harbour, but it's those heights that we were just referring to around the harbour. Because if French artillery can control those heights, the British fleet can't just sit inside of the harbour. Now, Napoleon takes this to his superior officers, and they don't exactly act on it. They hesitate. So imagine Napoleon, this brilliant, ambitious young man who's absolutely convinced that he's right. And he's watching these older men who have supposedly been there, have seen these things, and he watches them drag their feet. And you can almost feel the frustration. He doesn't just quietly accept it either. He pushes and he argues and he challenges and he pushes his own plan aggressively. He's exactly the kind of subordinate that any senior officer would find absolutely infuriating. But this time he's right. And those talents start catching the eye of some really important people. Napoleon becomes associated with one of the most powerful men in revolutionary France, and that man is Maximilien Robespierre. And he's the brother of the man who spotted Napoleon at Toulon and noticed his talent. Robespierre is one of the defining figures of the revolution. He's a man that's obsessed with virtue, with purity, revolutionary justice. But revolutions have a habit of becoming terror. Suddenly you've got executions, political purges, you've got paranoia hanging in the air like a cloud. And they've also got another nasty habit too. They eat their own. And eventually the Robespierre brothers and their clan fall. Arrested, executed by guillotine, gone. And because Napoleon had connection to that political orbit, his own future that was once looking so bright suddenly looks so uncertain. The same man, the same traits, the same ambition. But when the political winds change, yesterday you were useful, and now today you're a threat. And Napoleon is actually briefly arrested around this period, and his career appears to stall. And if history ends there, he's just this promising young artillery officer, but he's just reduced to a footnote. But luckily for Napoleon, history doesn't end there, because Paris erupts. Another royalist uprising threatens the revolutionary government, and suddenly France needs exactly the kind of man that it was nervous about yesterday. The government needs action, and Napoleon is going to provide exactly that. And he's not only going to provide it, but he's going to provide it brutally. And what he does is he positions his artillery in the streets in these narrow Parisian roads, and he turns them into kill zones. And when thousands of royalists advance down these narrow roads, he unleashes grape shot, which is a devastating anti-personnel blast. It's sort of a bundle of small bullets that looks like a bunch of grapes. And at close range, it's pretty horrific stuff. But importantly for Napoleon, it's efficient. And the uprising is crushed. And just like that, the same man whose future was looking uncertain, he's back. And he's back in a big way. And again, the pattern appears. The one we've just looked at. It's the same traits, but in a different context. Yesterday, he was a threat. He's this young man who knows military strategy well in uncertain times. He could take control of his men and cause problems. But today, he's a savior. And after the Paris uprising comes northern Italy. And this is where Napoleon really starts becoming Napoleon, because after Paris, he's given command of the French army of Italy. And on paper, that sounds pretty fantastic. But in reality, it doesn't look very glamorous. We're talking starving men, poorly clothed, underpaid, demoralized. They've been on the front for months. And now they're being told this intense young Corsican artillery officer is in charge. So picture it. You've got these veterans, these older men, grizzled veterans, men who've seen war. And Napoleon is only 24 at this time. And now some young, ambitious outsider is telling them what to do. But Napoleon is built different. And Napoleon has something difficult to fake. He's got that intensity that we mentioned earlier, that absolute conviction, that belief in his own ability. This image of Napoleon that the veterans have isn't going to last very long because very soon a strategic opportunity is going to present itself and he's going to have the chance to prove himself. Now, what happens is Napoleon is facing two enemy forces, the Austrians and the Kingdom of Sardinia Piedmont. Combined, they outnumber him. And if those forces are able to link up, Napoleon's got a serious problem on his hand. But luckily for him, geography creates an opening. Mountainous terrain, which is really awkward during this period of time. You know, there's no radios, there's nothing like that, so communication is awkward. Movement is slow. We don't have planes. Everything's got to be hauled over a mountain pass. And Napoleon sees that. He understands that. And under normal military thinking, the sensible move would be caution. Protect your supply lines. Maintain secure communication. Avoid overextension. Preserve your army. Because armies need food. They need ammunition. They need powder. They need to replace equipment. They need to have communication with the rear. And if those collapse, the campaign collapses. But Napoleon does something unusual. Instead of anchoring himself cautiously, he prioritizes speed and aggression and momentum. And he wedges himself right between these two forces, between the Austrians and the Sardinians. And he holds a central position on a mountain range, in a mountain pass, which means that these two armies are kept separate. And he can strike one, and then he can turn and he can strike the other. That's the theory. But if they coordinate properly, he's trapped, crushed between two armies. So it's not simply tactical creativity. This is a calculated risk. It works. He beats them separately instead of together. And then it works again and again. And suddenly this starving, demoralized army becomes something really dangerous. Now, stop and think about that. What lesson does a person learn from that? You take a battered force, you ignore conventional caution, you make an aggressive gamble, and it works. What are you supposed to conclude? That caution is wisdom? Or do you start believing that your instincts are exceptional? Because repeated success, it doesn't just build reputation, it builds belief, self-belief. And belief after enough victories can become certainty. And then comes Austerlitz. 1805, one of Napoleon's greatest victories. And if you're trying to understand why some people saw him as a genius, this is the battle to look at. Because it unfolds on a cold December morning. Mist hangs in the air over the battlefield. Two armies staring at each other, convinced they see weakness in each other. And what does Napoleon do? Once again, he's facing a potentially larger force. And Napoleon deliberately decides to appear weak on his flank. He invites aggression, he baits the enemy forward, and he lets them believe that they can see an opening. Now, when half the enemy force commits, believing that they're pressing the advantage, a gap opens right in the center. And that's the gap that he's been waiting for. And just like in Italy, he's going to split these forces in two. And then he's going to do the same thing. He's going to crush them separately. Now that's calculated. That's precise. It's the kind of victory that makes people stop saying, oh yeah, he's just talented, and start saying, this is someone who's brilliant, or even genius. And again, if you're Napoleon, what lesson are you learning? You're learning that your instincts are exceptional, that when others hesitate, you're the man who acts, and that boldness, that it works, and that aggression works, and that relentless conviction works, and perhaps most dangerously, that you're right. Just a year earlier, he crowned himself Emperor of the French. Just pause on that for a second. Just think about this. The awkward outsider, the difficult young artillery officer, the man who very likely rubbed many people the wrong way, is now placing a crown on his own head. And for a long time, history seems to reward him for it. But Napoleon is a gambler. And there's one thing that every gambler knows. If you play enough hands, eventually the house comes knocking. And for Napoleon, the house is Russia. Hundreds of thousands of men march east. One of the largest armies that Europe's ever seen. 600,000 strong, the Grand Army. But as they march, every encounter with the Russians frustrates Napoleon. The Russians refuse to play ball, and they retreat deep into the vast expanse. They burn supplies, they burn shelter, they abandon territory, and they refuse to hand him the decisive victory that he so badly wants. But he's Napoleon, so he presses on. And he keeps pressing on. And eventually he reaches Moscow, a vast city. And when he gets there, it's eerily quiet. Surely this is it. Surely this is the decisive moment. Surely this is where the knockout blow comes, where the Russians stand and fight. And what do the Russians do? They burn the city. There's no triumphant surrender, no neat political resolution, no glorious ending. Just a ruined city. Winter approaching. And reality starting to set in. And now he has hundreds of thousands of men, severely overstretched, miles and miles and miles overstretched, with nowhere to stay. And they don't get to simply just walk home. Winter's here. We're talking cold, starvation, disease, exhaustion, constant harassing attacks as they walk home. An army in collapse. And now suddenly, all those same traits that we've talked about previously look very different. Now what is he? Is he still bold? Or is he reckless? Is he still decisive? Or is he incapable of restraint and flexibility? Still a visionary? Or simply just blinded by his own certainty? Because here's the uncomfortable question. Did Napoleon fundamentally change? Or did the outcome change how we interpret him? Because if courage becomes recklessness once it fails, and conviction becomes arrogance once it collapses, what exactly are we judging? The trait or the outcome? Because that question becomes far more uncomfortable when we stop talking about men history ultimately celebrated and start talking about men history condemned. Because it's one thing to ask whether failure changes how we judge a man. It's another to ask something much darker. What if recognizing a man's true character before it was too late could literally change the course of history? And to explore it, we need to now leave Napoleon behind and step into a cold Soviet prison cell in the early hours of the morning, long before light. An old man is jolted awake on a narrow bunk somewhere in the Soviet Union. The night is cold. Sleep doesn't come easily here. And when it does, it rarely brings peace. Because tonight, he wakes breathing heavily, disoriented for a moment, still half in a dream, still half a young German soldier, terrified. Instinctively, his hand moves to the scar on his face. A habit, a reminder, a souvenir from another war. 1916, the Somme, when he was barely more than a boy. Artillery, the screams, the chaos, a different kind of hell. And then reality sets back in. The bunk, the cold, the Soviet Union. Because he's older now, much older and much thinner. Worn down by years of labor, starvation, and terror. A forgotten man. Or at least, that's how it feels. And as he lies there, his thoughts drift. Back. Back to another life. He remembers coming home from that first war. Alive. Scarred. But alive. He remembers meeting his wife not long after. Falling in love. Building a life. He remembers becoming a father. Those tiny faces looking up at him. Trusting him. Depending on him. And now, lying here decades later in the cold, the thought creeps back in. Do they still remember me? Are they even still alive? And then another thought creeps in. Quieter. Heavier. What was it all for? And if this sounds like some kind of bleak historical novel, I assure you it's not. Because for some young German men, this really was the shape of their lives. They'd survived the Somme. They'd survived the entirety of the First World War, and then the entirety of the Second World War. And if you're in a Soviet prison, you very likely survived the deadliest theater of the Second World War, only to remain in Soviet captivity for years and to perish in Soviet captivity, cold, forgotten, unknown to history. And to understand how a man goes from terrified teenage soldier to hopeful father to broken old prisoner lying awake in the dark, you have to understand the Germany he came home to in 1918. Because Germany in 1918 wasn't just defeated, it was shattered. And this is the Germany that he comes home to. The same old man lying on his bunk in the Soviet Union. Only in 1918, he's a young man. Scarred, alive. And he's trying to build something that resembles a life. Everything that he knew before the war is gone. The Kaiser's gone. The empire that he fought for is gone. Millions are dead. And many of them are his friends. Friends from school, boys that he grew up with. Some were never even found. But the ones that did come home were never the same again. Now imagine that for a second, not as a historian, not with the benefit of hindsight, but as him. You've survived one of the deadliest bits of combat that history has ever seen in the First World War, and one of the deadliest battles of the First World War, the Somme. You survived years of industrial slaughter out there, and somehow you make it home, somehow by the grace of God. And then you fall in love and you build a family. And this is what you've inherited? A nation in chaos? Because the violence doesn't simply stop when the war ended in Germany. It just changed shape. Now you've got communists, nationalists, paramilitary groups, armed men fighting in the streets, political assassinations, attempted uprisings. A very, very fragile republic that's constantly looking like it might just tear itself apart. And then came Versailles. Now, whether the Versailles Treaty was justified or not is almost beside the point here. What matters is how ordinary Germans experienced it, and for many of them it was humiliating, it was punishment and national disgrace. And Germany was forced to accept responsibility for the war, forced to pay crushing reparations. It lost territory. The military power was gutted. The national pride was stripped away. You know, this is a fighting people. They're very proud of their military prowess. And if you're a man who fought in the trenches for that army, who watched your friends die for that empire, it doesn't exactly feel like diplomacy, does it? It feels like humiliation. And for a man who's already survived one catastrophe, that matters. Because he's not a historian. He's a traumatized young man. He doesn't know what comes next. He doesn't know how this story ends. All he knows is that he fought for his country. He's watched his friends die. He's come home with a brand new scar on his face. And now the nation he bled for is broken. But what's worse than wounded national pride? Those little faces that stare up at him, his children, are hungry. His wife looks thinner than ever. The money in his pocket means less and less by the day. And when you've suffered for so long, only to watch that suffering start reaching your children, that changes people. And if that wasn't enough, things are about to get far worse for the German population. Way worse. Because in 1923, Germany experiences something called hyperinflation. And it almost sounds fictional. Think about this for a second. Imagine opening your banking app tomorrow, whatever bank you're with, you open your phone and you go to your banking app. And the number's still there. It still says 50,000 or whatever your life savings say. But commercially, it just doesn't mean what it used to be. Suddenly money doesn't stretch as far as it used to. Prices are rising rapidly, really fast. Food costs more, basic essentials cost more, but wages aren't keeping up. At first, maybe it's like, no more little luxuries, no more impulse buys, no more treats. But then it gets worse. The money you thought would become a house deposit, now that's spending money. And the money you thought you were saving for retirement, now that's survival money. And every week it buys less, then less again, and less again. And I mean, there's accounts from this period of people rushing to spend their wages the moment they're paid, because even if they waited one more day, it could mean that they could afford far less. So you've got families selling possessions to buy food. You've got parents watching their savings evaporate and at the same time trying to feed their family, trying to keep the kids happy and fed and healthy. And if you're the man that we've been following, what are you going to do when your children are going hungry? What are you going to do when your wife is way thinner than she was a year ago? And no one seems to be able to stop any of it. Not a politician, no institutions, there's no systems that are in place to stop this. And when people feel abandoned by the system that's meant to protect them, they start looking elsewhere. And that doesn't mean that they're looking for democracy. They're not looking for nuanced opinions on this. What they need in desperate times like that is solutions. They're looking for order and for strength and for someone who sounds certain. Because when you've got so much instability, certainty can be incredibly attractive. Especially when the people currently in charge just seem paralyzed, just talking, debating, promising. All the while, your life keeps getting worse. Because at some point, words and rhetoric stop meaning much. People start wanting actions, solution. They want to see movement. Anything that feels like something is actually taking control. And then, through all that noise, through all that chaos, one voice starts getting louder. Another outsider, not entirely unlike our friend Napoleon. Now, this is a man promising strength, action, national restoration, except this time, he isn't French. He isn't even a German. He's Austrian. But he is a veteran. A veteran of the very same war as the old man lying on that bunk. A man who also wore the uniform, who also saw the trenches, who also experienced Germany's defeat. And on the surface, he sounds like exactly the kind of man who understands. Because unlike politicians in suits, he doesn't sound cautious, he doesn't sound measured. He doesn't sound like another man offering excuses. He sounds angry. But not only angry, he sounds confident. And more than that, he seems to understand your anger, your humiliation, and your fears. And he gives those fears a target. And he doesn't just offer explanations. He offers enemies, people to blame. Communists, politicians who betrayed Germany, the elites, the profiteers, the groups he insists are responsible for your suffering. And now psychologically, that's so powerful. Because once someone convinces you that they understand your suffering and they tell you exactly who and what's responsible, the line between ally and opportunist can get really blurry. Because the enemy of my enemies starts sounding like a friend. And then there's the streets. Because this isn't just speeches, this is force. Uniformed men marching, fighting, projecting strength. And think about who that appeals to. Men who've just come home from war. Men who understood structure, order, brotherhood, purpose. Men who returned to a fractured society and suddenly found themselves adrift, a nobody, confused and lost. Because war, for all its horrors, it does give men something. It gives them identity, and it gives them a mission and something to belong to. And now when you've thrown hundreds of thousands of men into that situation and it suddenly disappears, something else needs to fill that vacuum. And for some men, joining a movement like this doesn't feel like becoming evil. It feels like you're becoming useful again, becoming part of something again, becoming strong again. And for ordinary people watching from the sidelines, watching all the chaos, watching this weak leadership, watching the prices spiral, the street violence, the promises start sounding tempting. The national restoration, the order, the action, a future. And that man was Adolf Hitler. And of course, with the benefit of hindsight, we know exactly how this story ends. There's world war, there's cities reduced to rubble, industrialized murder, the Holocaust, tens of millions dead. So from where we stand now, the answer feels obvious, right? How could anyone not see it? But history's never that clear in the moment because hindsight makes monsters look inevitable. But in the 1920s and even in the early 1930s, that mask hadn't fully slipped yet. It's not revealed itself. And in fact, for most ordinary Germans, part of their life appears to be improving. The political street violence that had made the Republic feel unstable is reduced. The sense of national humiliation is replaced with pride. And the economy, at least on the surface, appears to be improving. Jobs are returning, infrastructure projects, rearmament, a feeling that Germany was standing up again. And then came the optics. You've got mass rallies, order, discipline, unity, and they even launched this thing that's a state-sponsored holiday program, sending regular Germans on holiday called strength through joy. And it doesn't only send them on holiday, it sends them to concerts and cruises and the promise that ordinary Germans mattered again and that life could be better and that Germany could be great again. Sounds a little bit familiar, doesn't it? And from the comfort of hindsight, that can sound absolutely absurd. But history doesn't feel absurd when you're living in it. Because if your children are no longer going hungry, if the streets feel more stable, if the political chaos of the Weimar years appears to be fading, and life is genuinely improving, ask yourself this: would you question the morality of your leader? Or would the results speak louder than the rumours? And this is where things are going to start getting really, genuinely uncomfortable. Because the violence hadn't simply just disappeared. It just changed shape. Because once Hitler seized power, the political chaos of the Weimar years, the communists fighting, the nationalists in the street, the multiple factions battling for ground, that was fading. But now the violence was increasingly coming from one direction. The same brown shirts marching through the streets promising order were also intimidating opponents, silencing critics, spreading fear. But now it looks official, it looks organised. It's not just random men fighting in alleyways. And psychologically, that changes things because once violence starts wearing the clothes of authority of the government, most people stop questioning it. They just start assuming the government knows what it's doing. These people must deserve it. It's necessary. And if you weren't the one being targeted, how much would you choose to see? Because even when rumours start circulating, even when neighbours suddenly start disappearing, even when fear quietly spreads beneath the surface, what happens if life also does still continue improving? Because human beings have a special talent of rationalizing things, especially when they want to believe. And if someone convinces you that your suffering was caused by a particular group, and then life appears to improve after that group is being pushed out, how many people start thinking, maybe the rumors are true? Maybe they really were the problem? Here's the problem with that. Every success made it easier to ignore those warning signs, because Hitler didn't immediately lead Germany into catastrophe. At first, he's winning. One of the clearest examples of this comes in 1936, the Rhineland. Under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was forbidden to have military power, and they were forbidden from militarizing the region. And what does Hitler do? He sends troops in anyway. And this is a massive gamble, and it's a serious one too, because if France responds militarily, Germany is in serious trouble. And in fact, some German officers later admitted that they likely would have been forced to retreat. But that's the problem though. France doesn't act. And not only France, but Britain doesn't act. So the gamble pays off. So does Hitler look reckless? Or does he look bold? Like he knows what he's doing, like a leader restoring German strength while all the old powers hesitate. And this is a massive moment for Hitler because, like our friend Napoleon, every successful gamble reinforces belief, not just in the leader, but in the idea that the leader must be right, because success has a way of doing that. It transforms boldness into brilliance, conviction into wisdom. And if enough gambles pay off, people stop asking whether the leader is right and they start assuming that he is right. And remember, many German people weren't seeing this as the beginning of like this world conquest. They were seeing this as the undoing of the Versailles Treaty, as the undoing of the national humiliation that they were facing, and restoration of sovereignty. Pride returning where shame once lived. And then he does it again in Austria, the Anschluss. Hitler's homeland is absorbed into Germany, not through continental war though, but through political pressure, through intimidation, and overwhelming support from many people who believed that reunification made sense and that it was a good idea. And again, many Germans celebrated this because it's not collapse, there's no disaster, it's another victory, another restoration, another moment where Hitler proves his critics wrong. And then he does it again in the Sudetenland. And what does the world do? It backs down. Europe's just staring at him with its mouth open. Neville Chamberlain returns to Britain waving that piece of paper around. Peace for our time. And from the perspective of many ordinary Germans and ordinary people, maybe it looked like Hitler was achieving what others had failed to, what others couldn't in so long, restoring German power. And you got to remember, there's no catastrophic wars. It's not like the First World War has repeated, and this is a continent that's very traumatized from the First World War, by the way. And so, if he's doing all these things without wars, that's what makes this so dangerous, because all this success, it has this way of just silencing the doubters, especially when the alternative, people remember, is chaos, humiliation, starvation, political collapse. Because every victory makes the next step feel more reasonable. Every success shifts the line a little further, and slowly, almost without noticing, people can start accepting things that they once would have just rejected outright. But eventually, they do cross a line. And on the 1st of September 1939, Germany invades Poland. And for the first time, the world doesn't back down. Britain declares war. France declares war. And it appears that the gamble has finally gone too far. Or at least, that's how it appears. But then Poland falls. And not only Poland, then Denmark, then Norway, then Belgium, and then the Netherlands, and then finally France. And France is one of Europe's greatest powers, and it collapses in a matter of weeks. And from the perspective of many Germans, how do you argue with that result? I mean, you've gone from being this humiliated nation into controlling the whole of Western Europe. I mean, even if you don't agree with war, when countries are falling in a matter of days or weeks, how do you argue with the man who keeps proving everybody wrong? The generals who doubted him? Wrong. The politicians who criticized him? Wrong. The military leaders who try to contain him and control him? Wrong. Again and again and again. Because success has that dangerous habit. It doesn't just silence critics, it convinces people that criticism was never justified even in the first place. And if enough victories start piling up, people just stop questioning the leader. They start trusting him and they start believing him. They start believing that he can't be wrong. But history has another habit. The same traits that create success can also eventually lead to catastrophe. They slowly transform into something else. Arrogance, hubris, delusion. And again, just like Napoleon, the man who seemed unstoppable eventually starts believing it himself. And once most of Western Europe is under Nazi control, Hitler and his armies start looking east, toward the Soviet Union. And I think it's worth pausing here for just a second to appreciate just how absurd this decision was. Remember France, right? It had fallen in just 6 weeks. 6 weeks. One of Europe's greatest powers historically, crushed in breathtaking speed. But that's the thing, the Soviet Union isn't France. Because think about this, you can fit France inside of the Soviet Union roughly 31 times. 31. Think about that. Even if Germany had somehow maintained its 6-week pace, for every France-sized piece of territory that they conquer, it would still take years to overrun Russia. Years. And yet, just like Napoleon, Hitler believed he could do it. And then it happens. And it starts with Operation Barbarossa, which is the largest invasion in human history. Millions of men, thousands of tanks. And it's one of those campaigns that, until you really start looking into the campaign in more detail, it almost defies comprehension. But at first, it looks like another victory for Hitler, another gamble, another masterstroke. Because he does these huge encirclements that involve massive Soviet losses. Entire armies are just wiped out. He starts to appear like he's right again. And because the Soviet Union is so vast and he is taking over territory the size of France, he appears to be right. And he's able to do this again and again and again. And while there's no decisive victory, it looks like he has a decisive victory, at least on the way. If you're an ordinary German watching this unfold, what lesson are you supposed to be learning? That caution is wisdom? No, we've seen that before. That restraint is strength? No, we've seen that before. Or that the man that everyone warned you about keeps proving everyone wrong. But like we said before, the Soviet Union isn't France and it isn't Poland. And the Soviets refuse to behave the way that Hitler expects them to. And they retreat. And they disappear into the vastness, into the hinterland. And they're trading land for time, land that they can spare. All the while, Germany is getting drawn deeper, further from home, further from its supplies, further from certainty. And while he does have radios and planes and things like that, you still cannot continue to stretch your supply lines like that and expect it to be a good thing. And with Russia, the further you go, the more there is, it seems. And as the gates of Moscow begin to loom large, Hitler starts thinking, surely this is it. Surely this is the decisive moment, the final payoff, the knockout blow. And when that decisive victory fails to materialize, Hitler does what men like this often do, and he doubles down. And after so many victories, he's desperate for another decisive victory. And he turns south toward Kiev, which is now in Ukraine. And his commanders warn him against this bold move, but Hitler ignores them because he knows best, right? He's proven it over and over. He's a genius. At least that's what history keeps telling him. Now, tactically, it actually is a huge success, and it's one of the largest encirclements in military history, which again involves massive Soviet losses. And it's brilliance, or so it seems. But tactical victories are not strategic victories. And every mile that supply line continues to stretch, every delay that the Soviets create gives them more time. Every apparent success costs men. Men that Germany can't afford to lose because they're not like the Brits. They don't have all these territories and colonies. And with fewer and fewer men to spare and supply lines stretching longer and longer, the steamrolling blitzkrieg begins to grind to a halt. And reality stops behaving properly or properly towards Hitler. And when reality stops behaving the way that you expect it to, that's when things can start to get quite dangerous, because certainty is wonderful up until it collides with reality. And this is where the house comes knocking. And this is where the illusion finally starts breaking, because whilst the war would continue for years, Hitler's armies never make it beyond Moscow, and they never march down the promenades of Moscow, at least not as victors. And once momentum breaks, everything shifts and everything changes. Because the thing about systems built on relentless forward movement is they become incredibly vulnerable when forced backward. And now Germany is reacting. Germany is the one retreating, losing the initiative, and the costs become unimaginable. But beneath the surface, something even darker has been unfolding. Because by now, this was no longer simply a war about territory or influence or national pride. This is a war of ideology, an ideological struggle between two massive superpowers. The enemy's Hitler has spent years identifying, blaming, dehumanizing. Thousands, if not millions, are now falling under German control. And this is where the mask finally comes off. And it's not all at once, but enough that it can no longer be ignored. And the rumors become policy, and the prejudice becomes law, and the hatred becomes machinery. And eventually the machinery becomes genocide. The Holocaust. Millions of innocent people systematically murdered. Not because of what they'd done, but because of who they were. Jews, Roma, disabled people, political opponents, human beings reduced to categories, and then reduced to numbers, and finally reduced to nothing. And by the end, the suffering is everywhere, in the camps, in the mass graves scattered across Russia, in the shattered cities, in the millions of lives crushed beneath the decisions by men that they would never meet. And by the end of the Second World War, around 80 million people would lose their lives. 80 million. And now when I just say that like that, it doesn't sound too impressive. But that's roughly the population of Australia. 3 times over. 3 Australias gone. And somewhere, an old man still lies in his cot in the cold black of night, alone. The same veteran we met at the beginning of this story. The same father who came home from the First World War. The same man who wanted stability, who wanted order, who wanted a future for his children. And now, looking back across the wreckage of his life, I wonder what he's thinking. About his wife, about his children, about the promises, about the victories, about the years lost behind barbed wire, and about all the suffering that followed. And perhaps, after everything, one question still rings through his mind. What was it all for? Then somewhere down the corridor, he hears it. The faint echo of boots against the concrete. The guards beginning their morning rounds. The old man blinks. Morning already? A whole night lost to nightmares and memories. And now another day begins. A young man sits by the fireplace in a rough log cabin deep in the wilderness of Indiana. The year is 1820. Outside, darkness. Trees stretching endlessly into the frontier. The occasional call of a distant owl. No cheering crowds. No military command. No grand uniforms. No obvious path to greatness. Just silence. But thought, reflection. And as he sits by firelight, he reads, long after everyone else has gone to sleep, turning page after page, thinking, questioning, wondering. And if we're honest, this doesn't exactly sound like something or an image that we associate with greatness. Because when we imagine great leaders, we tend to imagine something else entirely. We imagine action, certainty, conviction, things we've already spoke about. The sort of people who walk into a room and they just sort of seem to bend it to their will. The sort of people who never seem to doubt themselves. The sort of people who always have an answer. But this young man, he spends most of his time thinking. Many who knew him would later describe him as melancholic, maybe even a little depressive. And if we're being honest, those aren't exactly traits that we'd put on a recruitment poster for a wartime leader. They're too emotional, they're too reflective, too slow, too uncertain. Because if your country's falling apart, if civil war looms on the horizon, and if lives depended on your decision, would you really choose the overthinker? The man who questions himself? The man who spends hours reflecting? Or would you choose certainty and confidence and conviction? Someone who looks like they know exactly what they're doing. And yet, that quiet, reflective young man would still go on to become one of the most admired leaders in modern history. So admired, in fact, that they carved his head into a mountain. Abraham Lincoln. And what makes Lincoln so fascinating is that he seems to be the inversion of everything we've looked at today. Because unlike Napoleon or Hitler, or even maybe Churchill, Lincoln doesn't seem especially driven by the need to appear brilliant. He's a listener. He reflects. He doubts. He doubts himself. And doubt is interesting because we usually frame doubt as weakness or uncertainty, maybe even a little bit of lack of conviction. But doubt can also force something else powerful, reflection. And reflection slows down action. In a crisis, that can sound a little bit unattractive. We saw earlier how mesmerized people become by movement and by certainty and by momentum. But slowing down creates something valuable. It creates time and separation, time to consider alternatives, time to challenge your own assumptions, and time to reassess, and time to adapt. And adaptation might be one of leadership's most underrated strengths. Because if there's one thing that we've already seen so far, it's what happens when leaders lack flexibility. Now, Lincoln definitely valued reflection, but he also understood something else important about reflection. And that is that there comes a time where reflection must give way to action. Because opportunities rarely wait for us to feel perfectly ready. And perhaps nowhere was that lesson more frustrating for Lincoln than in one of his most prominent generals, George McClellan, who was brilliant at organization, excellent at building an army, but maddeningly hesitant. And at the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln believed that he finally had his chance. He knew that Lee's army had been bloodied and that they'd been driven back. And when an army's driven back, they're vulnerable. But McClellan hesitated because he was convinced that the enemy was stronger than they really were. He was convinced that he needed more men, more certainty. He needed more time. And all the while he's deliberating, the opportunities just slipped away. Lee's escaped. And eventually Lincoln reaches the point every reflective leader must face. Because thinking is valuable, but endless thinking isn't leadership. And at some point you have to act. because inaction is still a form of action. You just chose not to do anything. And so Lincoln removes him, and it's not because McClellan lacked the intelligence or that he lacked the ability, but it's because the moment demanded action. The war's already happening. There's no more time to think. And perhaps that's what flexibility really is. Perhaps it's knowing when to think and knowing when to act. Because at the end of the day, thinking doesn't launch bayonet charges, does it? Action launches them. But action without thought, that's not courage, that's recklessness. And perhaps that's the thin line between reflection and paralysis, the line between courage and recklessness, the line between conviction and delusion. And it's the line that every leader eventually has to walk. Because reflection isn't simply slowing down, it's about a willingness to challenge your own assumptions, to care more about getting closer to the truth than protecting your own certainty. I think that instinct shows up clearly in how Lincoln built his government, because instead of surrounding himself with yes men, people who'd tell him exactly what he wanted to hear, Lincoln filled his cabinet with rivals, men who had opposed him, men who disagreed with him, men with egos of their own. Now compare that to the kind of leaders that we spoke about previously. Insecure leaders often demand loyalty and agreement and validation. They don't like being challenged. But Lincoln appears to value challenge. That's important, because even the most reflective people can become trapped inside their own thinking after all. If you're the only voice in the room, who's asking the questions you've been avoiding? Who's challenging the assumptions that you've attached yourself to? Who's pointing out the blind spots your ego does not want to face? Because reflection is powerful, but reflection alone can become an echo chamber of one. And Lincoln seemed to grasp that concept. And perhaps that's another one of these thin lines. Maybe it's the line between believing your ideas and becoming imprisoned by them. And nowhere is that more apparent than in the issue that Lincoln is most famously remembered for, slavery. And now it's tempting to imagine that Lincoln marched into an office one day with his pen in his hand and he's ready to abolish slavery immediately. But history's never that simple, it's always more nuanced. Lincoln definitely hated slavery, no one doubts that. But he knew being morally convinced of something and being strategically able to achieve it, they're not always aligned, they're not always the same thing. And so he waited and he watched and he measured the political landscape and considered the consequences. And then when the moment came, he acted. Not too soon, not too late. At least that's how history remembers it, because timing's everything. Timing matters. Context matters. A good decision made too early can fail, and a good decision made too late can fail. The challenge is finding that moment in between. And this is where things get really interesting, because it's easy for us to look back at outcomes that we already know and assign meaning. Lincoln looks wise, measured, reflective. He's a thoughtful statesman. But what if history had gone completely different? What if the Union had fractured, and what if his side had lost the Civil War? What if, for all that reflection and all that patience and all that restraint, they failed? Would we still remember Lincoln as the deeply wise, reflective leader that history celebrates? Or would we dismiss him as a coward, a hesitant coward, a man paralyzed by decision while his country burned? Because if the answer changes depending on the outcome, then what exactly are we judging? The trait or the result? And if that sounds familiar, it should, because that's the exact question that we asked about Churchill. Think back to 1940. Britain stands alone. France has fallen. The German war machine appears unstoppable. Churchill refuses peace. He refuses compromise, refuses negotiation. And today we look back on that and we call it courage, we call it conviction, resolve. But imagine for a moment that Britain falls. Imagine Germany wins the war. Imagine Churchill's gamble fails. Now does history remember him as courageous or reckless? A stubborn old man too blinded by his own conviction to save his country? And this is where things get much messier. It's much messier than simply saying this trait is good or that trait is bad, because maybe traits don't carry neat moral labels. Maybe they have these neat face values, but when they collide with reality, maybe context matters far more than we'd like to admit. Maybe outcomes matter more than we'd like to admit. Napoleon's boldness looked like genius until it was recklessness. Hitler's certainty looked powerful until it revealed itself as delusion and evil. Lincoln's reflection looks very wise to us now, but if he'd failed, and here's an even more uncomfortable thought, imagine Hitler's gamble had worked. Imagine Britain does fall, and imagine Nazi Germany dominates Europe. And then imagine that you and I are born decades later into that world, surrounded by books, by schools, by monuments, by stories and institutions, all telling us who the heroes were. Do you think that we grow up admiring Churchill? Or would we be hearing about some reckless British warmonger who refused peace and brought ruin upon his people? Because we love to say, the victors write history. And I want to be clear here, I'm not saying that moral truth doesn't exist. I'm not saying that outcomes magically make actions good or evil. That's way too easy. What I'm saying is that outcomes shape the stories that we inherit. And those stories shape which traits we learn to admire. Because boldness, if it saves your civilization, becomes courage. Boldness, if it destroys an army, becomes recklessness. Reflection, if it preserves a nation, becomes wisdom. Reflection, if the nation collapses, becomes cowardice. But the trait itself didn't actually change, did it? The story around it changed. And maybe that's why history is so dangerous. Because victory doesn't necessarily reveal the moral truth. Sometimes it only gives one side the power to tell the story with confidence. So maybe the task isn't to blindly reject history. And it isn't to blindly accept it either. The task is to pierce through the veil and ask what really happened. Who benefited? Who suffered? What was intended? What was ignored? What was justified after the fact? Because greatness is one of the most dangerous labels that we can give a person. And once we give it to someone, we often stop asking what it costs. Because the same fire that forges greatness can also burn everything to the ground. That's all for this week on History on Repeat, and as always, the past has more to say if we're willing to listen.